So in that introduction, you didn't hear the word agriculture, right? So humbly before you, but what I really want to talk about is to think with you, and to think with you in disobedient ways, in the hopes of creating both an intellectual and political activism that can change this world that is in deep crisis everywhere. Okay, so I'm hoping to create chaos, and that sometimes you'll think, what's the connection there between those two things? And that's exactly the point. You make the connection. I can't make some of those for you. You'll make them coming out of the work that you're doing and the commitments that you have. And I'm just going to throw out several things that I'd like you to think about in this moment that we inhabit. And then I'm hoping you have some questions, and we can work with the questions to make sure that you haven't been talked at, but that we've really started maybe a dialogue, okay? Even if it's an uncomfortable one, that's absolutely good and fine. Okay, so the work I've been doing in the United States for the last 3 years has been with a lot of the anti-imperialist, anti-militarist work that women and men and people of all sexual, gender, racial identities, how they come to feel about empire and imperial thinking. So to the extent that we are at the heart of empire, even maybe if it's disassembling, I think we see less, and the we here is very differentiated. It's not a universal we at all. But there is a we that is imperial and benefits from imperial thinking and action. So what I want to do is both deal with the specifics and the more general connections here of the systems of power that affect everything. And so clearly agriculture as well, whatever that is, all right? Not to mention, I use the word woman, but whatever that is, okay? So the point here is that I am working from a notion, and I actually started writing about this in 2008 when Obama was running for president, that the idea that we are in a moment of singularity. And the physicists, that notion of singularity says that change is happening all the time, and it is continual. But at a certain point, it comes together in such a way that nothing before will be recognizable. I think we're just about there, whether it's the idea of sexual identity, racial identity, even though there is statisticity and a whole lot of stuff that doesn't change, there is so much that is changing that if you're not thinking about what doesn't change and what does change simultaneously, you really can't be in the moment, all right? Which is always new old and also old new. So the idea here is you have to have a historical perspective of what has happened. And so to me, history always has to be in your mind. If you live in the United States, that would mean chattel slavery. It would mean thinking of the Atlantic Ocean as a huge burial site. So the idea here, again, of that you got to go deep and really try to think and see to be able to maybe see more. And the more is really where we're headed today, okay? Without the binaries, without the oppositions, but rather with the fluidity and the staticity that defines the changing meanings of racism, of misogyny, of capitalism. Okay, so let's jump cut here for a minute. One of the major things I've been writing about for about the last couple of years, both in Al Jazeera and in Feminist Wire, So you can go read more carefully what I can't do here today. And the argument here is basically to say that as things change, they don't. And so the point of really trying to see notions of privilege and how, as the Republican Party makes so clear to us, so much does not change, and at the same time, there are possibilities for new creativity, all right? So the point here is to talk about the invisibilities, all right? And that's what I started to think about when I was first asked if I'd come in and talk with you today. I thought to myself, okay, so agriculture, what's invisible there? You know, if you start with agriculture. And I mean this kind of intellectually, politically. You start with agriculture, and for a lot of people that means pre-modern. It sets up a notion of pre-modern and modernity. But at the same time, agriculture today has many different facets to it, depending on where it's located, whether it's corporate, whether it's industrial, whether it's post-industrial, whether it's agrarian. So the point again is what happens to the notion of gender in those different locales. The idea here is gender can't and doesn't stay static, and yet of course it does. All right, so jump cut again. In terms of the biggest amount of labor that happens in this world, it is collecting wood for fire and hauling water. And more than 75% of that is done by women and girls. It is also at the root of much of the sexual violence in war-torn countries as what? As girls and women go out to get wood and water. So in terms of some of the full developments right now about anti-sexual violence work across the globe by women everywhere, the wanting to rearrange that relationship to water and wood, and the whole notion of the sexual division of labor, all right, that is both implied in the concept of agriculture and also stands outside it, all right? So the notion again of a society, of a world system, of a global economy that talks about what is produced and talks so much less about what is silently reproduced. So the whole sexual reproductive system of the sexual division of labor, the whole concept of domestic labor, the whole concept of consumer labor, the whole concept of farming labor, the multiplicity of labors done, if those were in sight, how could one ever think that women are unequal? They do quadruple the amount of labor everywhere. So the idea of, you know, what is patriarchy? Patriarchy is the flipping of reality. It is the silencing and the making invisible, particularly women of color across this globe. So the notion again of how so much of what we think about already is structured in these kinds of formations. Okay, so I mentioned to you some of the writing that I've been doing. So one of the pieces was criticizing Piketty. Have any of you read his book, Capital? Yeah? So of course, he acts like capital exists by itself, without the history of chattel slavery, without the structuring of the sexual division of labor, so in other words, capital to me, capitalism never exists by itself. It is not a singular system. But actually, huge numbers of radicals and progressives talk about the problem is what? Capitalism. And so my point here is you're thinking agriculture and I'm thinking capitalist racialized patriarchy. Okay? That's at the heart of anything you're going to look at in terms of really trying to understand these modalities. So I don't know, in the work you're doing, do people talk about the importance of intersectionality? Yeah, the language of it, that it's class and sex and race and you have to see them together. But interestingly, people normally are, if they use it at all, it's for the strategy. It's not for the problem. So my point here is you want to see the problem as multiple, okay, as marbled, as codependent. And then you realize you can't talk about them separately. So the Pope, everyone's been so supportive of the Pope. And me, I'm really, well, as I wrote, really, I'm not a big fan. Why? You're saying you're against inequality. He means what kind of inequality? Economic. Okay? So economic inequality, that's not good enough because actually the poorest of the poor are women and particularly women of color on this globe. So we still need what? Capitalism is not a sufficient analysis here for the problem of inequality, all right? So now he says we have to address the issue of poverty, right? How do you address the issue of poverty when all of the data, and there's plenty of it, says that a woman who cannot control her reproductive body will always be poor? So my point here, again, control the modes of production. Well, he's not actually saying that, and he's leaving the coffers filled. But the point again is, when do we push and say, no, you can't talk about poverty without the problem? The problem without what? The sectors being divided from themselves. All right? Now, I'm sure a lot of you read maybe Cornel West. Again, the problem for him, fabulous on anti-racism, but the problem, push comes to shove, it's capitalism. And so you do have the development of the Say Her Name campaign of black women in this country saying what? Say our names. You can't talk about the problem singularly, and you can't say that the problem of racism is of what? Of black men. It is black men and women and families together, and that Obama, his first initiative on race about 3 years ago was My Brother's Keeper, MBK, and that was to try to raise the life opportunities for black boys and men. Then in terms of what happened in our country, what happened? We had the murders of multiple black young men. But simultaneously, there were murders of black women. But there were no demonstrations about that. Kimberly Crenshaw and a whole group of both black, white, other colors of both men and women starting to say, Black Lives Matter, but say her name. So that this is a doubled vision, all right? So the point again of, I'm just asking for an intervention here, that whatever you're thinking about, you want to multiply the problem. You want to see it in its biggest capacity and not accept the dichotomy that if you're talking about something specific, that you have a special interest, rather than saying, we've actually done the universal for most of the history in the United States, right? The individual rights, human rights. There are many young women who will say, I'm not a feminist, I'm a humanist. Feminism is too narrow. No way. Feminism, an anti-racist feminism for sure, says what? We've done the concept of humanity with the male body at its center. We're going to now pluralize it. So this really asks for a different episteme, a different epistemology, which really means what? Just a theory of knowing. And it says that it has to be multiple. And if it's multiple, it has to be specific. So don't allow the idea that when you specify, you're narrow. When you specify, you're asking for what? To invert the false universality and give it specific meaning. you know, again, not to get boring with the United States history, but what is our history here? That, you know, the Constitution and rights, and then, okay, so it was really just about who? White, male, propertied individuals. What's the rest of our history? Just extending it. Keep extending it. And I will say, in this moment of singularity, I don't think that works. That actually what has happened is that people believe that you actually can make democracy out of what? These extensions while leaving the structural system of power in place. So again, I want to really ask you to disassemble the notion of individual and structural. Structures are made of individuals, but you have to deal with the structural realities in order to do what? To really open the possibility of individuality. Not individualism, but individuality. So I don't know, you know, I always, whenever I speak, I always feel like I owe you to know the latest thing I'm thinking, even though it might be totally a mess, all right? So I have this folder, I almost brought it today, but I thought I can't make agriculture go here. But it's democracy does not work. And why doesn't it? And I mean here, liberal democracy, which has become in this country neoliberal democracy. Or if you live outside this country, people will call it fascist democracy. Now, for those of you who think, well, how can you put those words together? It's the brilliance. It is brilliant, and it is done. So I'm asking you to be more brilliant and to think of other ways to dislocate the structural in order to then try to see how you can think about the notion here that democracy is demos. Demos means public. So what have we already made totally private and unseeable or not in view? Everything related to gender, sex, and race. So even if you look at the language of politics, if somebody is conservative or radical, it's all about what? What your position on capitalism is. The minute you start to put in there race and the issue of racism and patriarchy, what happens? None of it holds. So, you know, even the question of abortion, you can have people of very so-called different political positions, right, who will share positions on abortion. How is that possible? Well, because politics was never about bodies. Okay? So again, the idea here of the body and the earth, I don't know. I just think you could do fabulous things. You know, the earth, what could be better than starting with the earth? You know, starting with the notion of trying at this particular moment, you know, saving both the earth and our bodies. You know, let's get rid of war. Let's get rid of climate change, you know. So, and then again, what have I made room for? Revolutionary agriculture. You're supposed to at least chuckle? No? Okay. All right, so let me just throw out a couple of other quick points, and let's just see what you're thinking or wondering about, okay? So I think that, again, for tools for you to have, that the concept of intersectionality, the concept of overlapping, the concept of intertwining, the concept of interconnected, of multiplicity, and a term that I worked hard on for many years, a term that I just hated the work that I did. This is about 15 years ago. And the word "and" was always in everything, like racism and patriarchy. And so I didn't like "and." "And" makes it sound like the two are what? Separate, you know? So I started talking about racialized patriarchy, patriarchal racism. I'm just trying to give you some, you know, you got to make it up, you know, and then you can think. You know, just don't, you can't think well enough with what's given to us. You can't, all right? So again, in terms of feminist theory, the issue of what's same and what's different used to drive me crazy, all right? And so then there were some great black feminists in this country who said we're similarly different, we're differently the same. You know, just get rid of same and different, you know, because again, it makes it sound like you got a choice of which way you're going to go with it, all right? So with me as a political theorist, the term universal has enormous power, okay? Because it means what? Universal human rights. What could be better, right? The uni, the shared, right? The same, the similar. And so, but then I realized that there's a huge difference between same and similar. And I think we are similar. And, you know, equality that is the same, forget it. I don't want it. Most of you wouldn't either, really, if you thought about it. So the idea of what similar means what? That it's kind of almost the same, but it leaves room for difference. So when I was doing a lot of work with human rights activists who are very committed to the concept of universality, and many of whom I am very committed to, I just said universal doesn't work. It doesn't work. And so I said, at least, you know, I'm going to use the term polyversal. It cuts across and through, but it's multiple. And the book that I write this in is called Against Empire, for any of you if you really want to do some of the hard work of seeing the torture that I went through to come up with that, okay? So, and there, you know, you're going to be tortured if you start to think that, you know, my tools are not good enough. But our tools are not good enough because everything is always changing. And so a real problem with the academy is we don't change fast enough. We hold on to tools that really are outdated, on to thinking that really doesn't work. And so I'll just come back to this, thinking about hetero-racist misogyny in agriculture. Well, that's what I just did. Okay, so you want to ask anything or just come back at an idea? This is what maybe we could do.
Okay, you might hate this. I'm hearing you that when you talk to radicals, and you put that in quotes, or people from different political perspectives, you put that in quotes, you run into this unwillingness to acknowledge anything else but class. I'm sorry, yeah, people they're focused on income inequality, economic inequality, but they don't want to talk about the other things. I have the opposite problem, and I feel like I'm the persecuted Marxist, and everybody else is concerned with these micro perspective issues that make it so that people can't work with each other at all. You know, you can't understand, you know, one another unless you come from the same exact fabric, so on and so forth. So I spend most of my time feeling like the larger material struggles that we all share in get ignored for the micro level perspectives. And I'm hearing what you're saying, and I don't know who you talk to, but it's...
Well, let me just, first of all, I'd just like to orient this a little differently. When you say the material, you know, you want to talk about the material rather than the micro aggressions, whatever. And my point is it's all material. It all has that same status of material. And until people understand that, that's when you start to see the intersections here that really allow for a mobilized multiple proletariat. The proletariat's never been white and male, ever. Not historically, and definitely not today. Yet, unions, whatever part of the world you're in, that's the assumption. Migrants right now, primarily women, you know? So the point here is the material life that needs to be changed. And for those of you not Marxists, I mean, material is just the real, you know? The real that needs to be changed. And I'm saying that the sexual division of labor is as real as the division of labor that defines productive labor. And that those intersect and interplay with each other in such a fashion that if actually we deal with that, and there are real movements that are doing that now, that when you do that, then there really is a progressive politics. The other, to me, is implicitly, usually, white privileged and hetero-masculine. So you have to name it the other way, you know? But that's not to say that my point here is not to in any way dislocate the importance of class inequality, but to say, how come nobody wonders why all of the attempts to do something about class inequality, do you think maybe the problem is being seen too narrowly and that's why it's not being addressed? You know, that the notion here is a more multiple kind of framework. So the person behind you had, yeah.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the control of agriculture running in parallel to the control of reproductive systems in women's bodies, because they're both obviously life-sustaining, but have a long and arduous history of patriarchal domination.
So what are you thinking when you're asking that question?
It's just something I've been thinking about for a while, working in women's empowerment initiatives in India, and seeing there's so many parallels to both systems, but I haven't really done too much research on it myself, but it's just something I've been thinking
So,
about.
and you're saying the parallels to the two systems, and the two systems are?
Yeah, how they've been simultaneously politicized.
And you're saying simultaneous, and meaning agriculture here? I mean, that's what I'm just not quite sure what your two systems are that you're talking.
Smallholder farming
Yeah.
in India,
Yeah.
by women.
Yeah.
And how that, if you look at NGOs coming in and development organizations, tending to be primarily men working and men having the freedom to travel around to these villages and having that mobility, and then and maybe I need to think about it.
No, well, I just wanted to really have you articulate that so that it goes as far as you're ready to go right now. But it does seem to me that in the situation of what you just gave me, and you said men with NGOs and women who are doing the more micro agriculture, et cetera. I mean, I think that particularly in terms of issues of global capital, that can get in the way. Some of the worst NGO stuff is headed by women right now. And so the idea here is patriarchy comes in all genders. Again, that's part of the issue. So, but it does seem to me that in terms of the agriculture notion here of just trying to really see the way that farming, there are different layers of farming, there's different levels of corporatizing it, there are different levels of corporatizing the gendered aspects of that, then it seems to me that you would have an interesting modality to really think about. But that you don't want to keep in place a concept of gender that is static, as opposed to gender always has a historical specificity. And so in these issues, particularly in India, I have done a fair amount of work there, and the issue of really what some of the corporate takeover is, I actually think that if you started to think about bodies and the way that the control of bodies becomes central to any relationship to the earth, that you could come up with some very interesting thinking on that. Okay, so, and that's just also to me the most important construct that I work with all the time. And when I'm trying to think through things, I try to find the body. And then that means that that body, I have to make that body materially real. So it has a race, it has a class, okay, it has a sex, it has a gender. And then that multiplicity, because really it is the body that performs what? It performs labor, it performs sexual labor of all different varieties that really are at the base of all productivity. So the idea here is that you would have a different starting point it disallows certain kinds of borders and contours. And I think that, to be honest, I mean, I always, with my students, with whoever, I just share some of the tricks I've used to try to make my brain think better. And I do think of it as tricks, you know, that I'm thinking, and I know that it has to be too over universalized. So how can I make it more specified to really give it a chance at the universal? So I just think that no matter what's going on, you try to do that, to have a real political analysis. Most recently, when we were dealing with Ebola, which just seemed to have so many layers of all kinds of politics to it, you know. So if you just kept opening it that way, as opposed to the way it was presented to us, we think differently about it. And our country was an embarrassment. Yes?
Can you discuss, you mentioned white privilege. I'm interested to hear what you think of white privilege.
Well, it's everywhere, you know. At the same, well, let me ask you, just say a little bit more about what are you wondering about it?
I'm getting, as a woman of color, I find that it's challenging for me in working in development and agriculture, and challenging in a way in which I find that in my program there's not as many folks of color that I would like to see involved in agriculture and development. And so, I mean, it's hard to explain. And I guess I'm just curious about what your perspective is on white privilege and how that's interconnected to.
Well, white privilege it's really, really a problem. I mean, it is the universal, you know, and it universalizes all the time, right? So the point is you have to break into that. If you're a person of color, you break into it a particular way. If you're white and anti-racist, you have to break into it in a different fashion. But the point here is when you say there are locales that seem unfriendly, and then the point here is how do you really open the closures, right? And those are revolutionary questions. But I think that they have to be embraced as fabulous because they are, you know, in that sense, you know, so that they don't become just an extension. Yeah. They really become a restructuring. And it's not fair. Well, nothing's ever fair. But of course, where those burdens lie, they'll lie there until the structure starts to shift. So I assume that you can feel uncomfortable and challenged, and I would just say, so what? You have no choice, right? But the idea of how to open is also, white people are not good about white privilege, so you really have to be very aggressive, I think. And I mean aggressive, I love aggression in that sense, intellectual. So you need to say it, you need to name it. And that's not fair, it's totally not fair. But that's the only way you start to shift it. Yes? Yeah.
Well, you talked about the restructuring of development and specifically with agriculture, but what do you think that specific development looks like? Restructuring looks like, because me, myself, I'm an agricultural sciences major, and I'm one of like 4 people of color in my year. and out of the whole school. And out of the whole major, there's only 4 black people out of Cornell University in this specific major. Now, that might be like, oh, not a big deal. A lot of black people are going into agriculture. A lot of us are pushing it more into STEM and sort of the higher modes. But then it also brings up the question of like, well, then who's controlling the food supply? What about urban areas? Like, if people who aren't personally invested in that and they don't have that connection to the people living there, then why should people even do the right thing? So for me, the restructuring is like not only pushing kids of color to go into agricultural fields, which right now I actually feel like people of color, especially black people, at least my experience, we're being pushed away by our own people, away from agricultural fields, because it's like, oh, that's our history. Back then we worked in mainly agrarian, at least my family, where we worked as slaves, so we're going to try to get away from that. But then it's like, in my opinion, it's like conquering our former history by working in those fields, but us being the controllers of it, and us being our own bosses instead of chattel to our owners.
Well, you've of course said a lot here, okay? So the point though is as well that on some level until, and this isn't, I mean, it can't be done just by, you know, your particular department doing it, but it really is a real assault needs to happen about the way that these disciplines are defined. And so many of the disciplines are defined in ways that carve them in ways that make them not open, all right? And so the point here is the question is not just whether you would want to have more people of color in this program, but do you want that program the way that it is? So it's both ways here, the structural and not. And again, I want to say that color is and race are they are mobile and changing, and there is not an inherent politics that goes with any race or sex. So that the point here is that those intersections again are what I would want as progressive people of color. I really, you know, wouldn't care to have Carson on my team, or whatever. Can you believe? I mean, whatever. Okay, so anything else you want to just wonder about for?
Yeah, the role of the citizen in a fascist democracy. Your thoughts on that?
To never be silent, and to test yourself all the time. The more uncomfortable you feel, the closer you are to being a human being. So at this moment, I mean, it is a very complicated moment to live. We get more and more information of the way that we do drone killings. The Guantanamo prisoners are just in abhorrent conditions. And there are moments where you say I'll say I feel no different than the Germans who said they didn't know about the concentration camps. We know. So the idea here of the obligation to be disobedient and try to make that as collective as possible whenever you can is, to me, really important.
How would you go about doing that? Inside of academia, it's really good that we can listen to this, and I don't need to keep going down that road. But how to encourage the speech of the political lobby? Well,
I mean, my life is not really the academy anymore. I haven't done a session like this in a while, you know. So there are, I mean, in our country right now, there are mobilized political movements from everything to abolitionism around the prison system to Black Lives Matter, to reproductive rights that are completely under assault in this country. I mean, Texas just said they're going to take Planned Parenthood off of Medicaid. I mean, how is it that we're just not every one of us in the streets? I mean, that's really, you know, it's just amazing. So the idea, I mean, we've become such an obedient country, you know, when just terrible things are happening to people. So the idea here again that, you know, yeah, go ahead, target poor women, you know, and it is problematic as fewer and fewer middle-class women need abortions because they can afford some of the over-the-counter drugs. There is less of a mobilized movement than used to be in this country around that issue, when any woman, all women, would need an abortion if they did not want to go with a pregnancy. So I'm not that old, but you know, when I was in college, you know, I did go with friends who needed abortions, and they were illegal, and they were scary, you know. Those of us old enough to remember that really don't want things to go back to that. But the idea here of the you know, the ease and the complacency, and I think though, but I am really very supportive of wherever you're located, you know, just do what you can, because I do think that there is the chaos in this country, it has really gotten to a point where it may coalesce into important change. And that's back to my first point about singularity. We're also so not attentive that you can really not see things that are beginning to happen and then really mobilize with that. I saw a hand. Yes? Yeah.
I think one of the challenges these days is that we seem to be going in the direction of more and more like greater polarization, greater professionalization. So if you respond to injustice with aggression, it seems to push the right to respond with even more aggression and to further those divides. So is there, I guess that is something I get frustrated with, because it's like, do we need more dialogue and listening across these divides so we don't further entrench them? But then how is that doing justice to injustice if you're just sort of trying to engage in dialogue instead of really fighting back against it? And is that something that you have tried to work through much in your work or not?
Yeah, I mean, you know, at different stages of my life, I've had really very different, I'm in a stage right now that I'm much more agreeable and try to talk more broadly. There were periods in my life where I didn't believe in that at all. So, but some of that is really out of, I don't really think that our society is more polarized unless you're talking about the Republicans. And also the right wing in this country, it's never been more than 12%. You know, they're very noisy and they're very organized and they're very rich. But even when Reagan, his landslide, it wasn't a landslide. He won with 26% of the vote. You know, so the idea, and 12% of that were the real right wing. Now, of course, you all have grown up in a society where you think Reagan actually did some good stuff. So, I mean, I grew up where, you know, people were ready to leave the country. So, I mean, also, we have moved slowly more and more right wing. But the point here is I think that the mobilization around climate change, did any of you go to the big climate march 2 years ago? I mean, there were hundreds of thousands of us there, and it was everybody. I mean, it was a rainbow of different, I mean, talk about agriculture, there were tons of real activists who are doing work on the land all over the world. And they were maybe a third of the march. And then there were just people of every political stripe within a progressive commitment to what? Saving the planet. you know. But there is more and more. Now in Ithaca, I think next week, maybe it's Thursday or Friday night, This Changes Everything, the film that Naomi has worked on, Naomi Klein, it's going to be here in Ithaca for one night, you know. And it is an amazing film. And you may, I mean, given the work you do, you should go. You should just go and see it. It's at Cineopolis downtown. And I wish, it's only a one-night show. It's only here for one night. And also next week is the new documentary on the Black Panthers that really shows the way that half of the Black Panthers were Black women. And the director is just amazing. And that's going to be in town for about 5 days. And there's a talk back with some really fun people to talk back to the film on, I think it's Friday night next week. So, I mean, just to, you need to get energy for being able to think that you can make things happen. And there is stuff to do and that you can do. And thanks.